Welcome to Climate Conversation with Kamrul Sur, Climate Action Pathways, episode 29. What we know about climate change. We have known since the 1980s that digging up and burning coal, gas, and oil are producing heat blanket on the planet. By 1965, scientists were sufficiently concerned about the risk of climate change for humans that thus formally warned US President Lyndon B. Johnson. And the last IPCC report in 2018 on the 1.5 degrees target was absolutely clear. Every bit of warming matters. They say every action matters. Every choice matters. The time to act is now, and we don't have to wait for a new report to tell us that. Even if a leaked UN report wants that, worst is yet to come on climate change. We have today Alan Miller, one of the gurus of climate science, who has been warning it for over 50 years. So today, it is my pleasure to have a conversation with him, Alan Miller, one of our finest scientists.
Thank you.
What is your take, Alan?
Well, first, just let me say that the science climate history is even older than you mentioned.
Yeah.
So we actually have the first projections of a warming from a doubling of CO2 emissions going back to the turn of the 20th century, around 1904. Svante Arrhenius, a Swedish scientist, who actually thought it would be a good thing to have warmer winters in Sweden. So it's indicative of the fact that we've generally known that burning fossil fuels would warm the earth for a very, very long time. But maybe it's also worth emphasizing some of the complexities of the Earth's climate system are such that it's still today the case that sometimes even after disasters occur, we're not even entirely sure why. And that's because many times different factors can be involved. And the most recent example of that is the collapse of the 12-story condo in Florida, which occurred just days ago, and in which roughly 150 people are dead or missing. And we know that there was salt water flooding the building's garage and basement. We know that there was some subsidence, but it may be years before we actually know precisely what caused the dramatic collapse of that building. And I think that's indicative of a lot of the complexities of the climate and Earth system and issues about our lives, that sometimes things happen and we don't know until long after exactly why. But as you said, Kwamrul, the leaked version of the most recent IPCC report, which is not due still until somewhat later this year, now more than ever points to the urgency of dealing with these threats, not only because of simply extreme temperatures, but also because of things that will become more and more part of our conversation and vocabulary, feedbacks and tipping points. And feedbacks are things like when the ice melts and dark blue water replaces it, there is an albedo effect that increases warming and accelerates warming. Another one is with the melting of the permafrost, there are vast quantities of carbon dioxide and methane stored. And as the Arctic and permafrost melt, those will accelerate warming. So all of that is simply to say we are in a very precarious position now. And sometimes we don't even know how bad it is. But one thing we can say is what we don't know can hurt us. So those are my my brief introductory remarks.
And say you are writing, you have written a number of books. So in your latest book, though, you are here co-author. You have 3 more authors, I suppose.
Three of us told. Two
more. Yeah, well, 3 of you. Trial. You trial. So if you can also share some light about your new book, which you 3 produced after long research or your almost lifetime experience. Well, so if you share that also, that will be quite beneficial.
Thank you. I always appreciate the chance to promote a book. The book is called Cut Super Pollutants Now. It was just published a couple of months ago, and it's extremely timely, I think, because the focus is to explain that if we want to slow warming in the next 2 decades, we cannot do it by cutting fossil fuels. The effect of reducing concentrations of CO2 in the atmosphere is very, very gradual because CO2 has very long atmospheric life measured in centuries. So simply to stabilize CO2 in the atmosphere would require reductions of in excess of 80%, which essentially would mean shutting down the entire world economy. So there's no way that's going to happen. The second problem in trying to slow warming by reducing CO2 is the co-emission of sulfates, particles that are also released particularly from burning coal. So as we're fortunately gradually reducing combustion of coal especially, it's the most CO2 intensive source of power, we are also reducing associated sulfates. The problem with that is that in the short term, very short term, days, months, we also are eliminating a source of cooling. So we have the gradual reduction of a source of cooling through sulfates, which means that over the next 10 to 20 years, we'll have a very, very minimal reduction in warming from CO2 and an offsetting reduction in cooling from sulfates. Consequently, we need to find something that is much more fast acting. Fortunately, we have a number of what we've called super climate pollutants. And very briefly, I'll mention the 3 of most interest and relevance. They are methane, which is a gas released from oil and gas production, but also from the and also from wet rice production. Those are the 3 largest sources of methane. Methane over a 20-year period is more than 80 times more powerful as a contributor to warming than CO2 per molecule. The second is a chemical, man-made chemical called HFCs, which ironically were introduced as substitutes for ozone-depleting chemicals under the Montreal Protocol of 1987. They are not ozone-depleting. However, they are very potent greenhouse gases on the order of 1,200 times more powerful than CO2. But both HFCs and methane have atmospheric lifetimes that are much shorter, in the neighborhood of 10 to 15 years. Consequently, what we can do to reduce warming over the next 10 to 20 years and avoid these feedbacks and irreversible tipping points is particularly to focus on HFCs, methane, and one other, which is black carbon. And black carbon is not a gas. It is the particles that are released from burning wood in cook stoves and also from poorly controlled diesel engines. So we have most of the problems are a lot of the warming up to 0.5 degrees centigrade can be addressed just from the HFCs. And fortunately, we have taken some steps and are trying to reduce all three of these: the methane, the HFCs, and the black carbon.
Thank you. I have come to know that you are going to Alaska next week. So on what mission? Is it a scientific adventure, a research, or fact-finding mission?
Well, it is primarily not a fact-finding or scientific mission. However, I would say that some of my interest in Alaska over a number of years has been because we know that warming is occurring much, much faster at the poles, which was always predicted. And consequently, we have, for example, been seeing temperatures of approaching 40 degrees centigrade in Siberia. And we have had the hottest temperature ever experienced in Canada, 115 degrees, in a period in which the average temperature Fahrenheit would be in the 60s. So we are definitely experiencing extraordinarily rapid warming at high latitudes. And that is also associated with increasingly rapid melting of glaciers at rates which are expected to open the Arctic Passage, such that, for example, Russia and China are now very aggressively making plans for shorter shipping routes through an Arctic Passage. So that, I would just say, has sparked some of my interest. And however, this time I'm not going with other scientists, I'm going with my wife. However, it is perhaps still somewhat of an educational mission. It's a trip that has been organized for university alumni or graduates. And it's not a cruise, pleasure cruise. It is a trip with lectures and with excursions, side excursions to parks and for observing wildlife. So I guess my answer, Kwamro, would be I'm hoping that it's, if not going to create any new discoveries, it will at least help me personally speak much more directly and with greater understanding about what's going on further north.
Over there.
Further north.
Yeah. So going further north, before that, what is your take, your thought, especially on current bite of, say, heat wave, which is across North America and different parts of the world we are now observing right at this. What is your reflection?
Well, as you may have seen, there have been many efforts to explain what is described as a very specific and unusual condition called a heat dome, in which hot air is trapped over a very specific region in a way that can last for many days. And while it is not 100% agreed and established by scientists it's widely felt that this extraordinary heat event, this heat dome, is in fact far more likely to occur because of climate change. This is another term that, Kwamro, I don't know if you've discussed it in some of your many episodes, but I think one of the best terms to help understand the meaning of climate change is when it is referred to as a threat multiplier. And the concept of climate change as a threat multiplier has been mainly used in the context of security and conflict. So things like when migration occurs, and an issue that you're, of course, very much aware of and concerned with in Bangladesh, that the migration may be due to sea level rise, it may be due to hurricanes. We're experiencing some migration now from Central America that is quite clearly the consequence of extreme natural disasters. And those threats were all already there. We had migration, we had conflict, but climate change is a threat multiplier. It's making them even more dangerous. And I think the same term, threat multiplier, can be used for talking about things like heat domes and heat extremes, where yes, such events have occurred before, but their likelihood is now much greater. As with hurricanes, their intensity is also much greater. We're getting extreme rainfall events, things that used to be called 1 in 500 or 1 in 1,000 year event are now occurring as frequently as 1 in 10 years. So it's not necessarily that we can attribute every specific extreme event to climate change, but we can say that its likelihood and its intensity is made much greater. And so that's why I like to use this term threat multiplier.
Threat multiplier. You are absolutely right. Alan, coming to a very personal front, you have been in the climate change, environment, and natural sciences domain for very many years. I want to know from you, who has introduced you to the NASA, to the climate change, the field of environment? Who was your guru or gurus? Who are they? I want to know.
Well, okay, maybe you will answer.
Maybe
I hope you will answer the same
the
question.
Viewers, yeah.
Okay, I hope you will answer the same question, Conwell. No, I think it's actually a very important point to make, which is that all of us started somewhere and were influenced sometimes by one person, sometimes by many people along the way. And first, I should also add that you made me sound even older than I am. You said in your introduction, I've been doing this for 50 years. It's only 40. It's only 40 years. But the short version of a long story is that in 1978, I had returned from doing a research project overseas, actually in Australia. And it was just at a point when the United States was still very much influenced by Earth Day. We had created EPA only a few years before. And the American and Mexican scientists, Sherwood Rowland and Mario Molina from University of California, had published a paper just a few years before, May 1974, hypothesizing that chemicals called chlorofluorocarbons, man-made chemicals invented by DuPont that were being widely used, actually more than half at the time, were being used in cosmetic and deodorant products. And they were, because of other recent research of the time, becoming aware of the importance of atmospheric chemistry. And it had been noticed that these chlorofluorocarbons were actually originally identified as interesting because they didn't break down in the atmosphere like most chemicals do. They were extremely stable. And the original interest in them was, gee, we can use them as markers in the atmosphere. But Rowland and Molina said, well, gee, what happens to these chemicals as they rise in the atmosphere? And they did laboratory experiments. This is, you can imagine, in the 1970s, we had very limited tools for doing atmospheric research. So this was primarily done by simulating high atmospheric conditions. And what they discovered in their lab was that as chlorofluorocarbons went into the lower stratosphere, the intensity of the sun would break down the chemicals into their constituents, including particularly a very volatile chemical, chlorine. The chlorine, then they hypothesized, would react with ozone, which is the simply O3, the triple form of oxygen molecules. And this would be life disastrous because ozone is what absorbs most of the dangerous ultraviolet radiation that would otherwise cause skin cancer, blindness, and many, many ecological disasters. Anyway,
so that's how you came to the Montreal Protocol.
Well, I should shorten what otherwise, as I warned you, could be a very long story. I came back from Australia in 1978, and environmental activists were becoming more and more responsive to this research from Rowland and Molina. And they said, this is insane that we are going to endanger the earth for cosmetic products. And at the time, the US was very, very environmentally active after the first Earth Day. And consequently, consumers responded to this. Companies started advertising contains no chlorofluorocarbons. And EPA instituted regulations in 1978. So I was hired by an environmental group, and one of the extraordinary benefits of the position was I was introduced to Professor Rowland, and I worked with him. And that was my introduction to global environmental science, global environmental issues. And several years later, the World Resources Institute was started. And the founder, Gus Speth, who I'll connect you with because he would be a wonderful interview for your climate channel.
Yeah.
Gus Speth started the World Resources Institute in 1982. And I was among the first 20 hires to work with another friend and colleague who you know, Irving Mintzer.
Yeah.
And we started the climate program of the World Resource Institute, the two of us, in 1984. So my real mentors and the sources of my career engagement with global environment had to do with working with particularly Sherwood Rowland in the late 70s, and then with Gus Speth and Irving Mintzer in the mid 80s. And they were all extraordinary people. And Professor Rowland and Mario Molina received the Nobel Prize in Chemistry for their work in 1995, one of only 3 Nobel Prizes to this day that have been given for work related to the global environment. The others, of course, were the Nobel Peace Prize given to the IPCC and the Nobel Prize in Economics given to William Nordhaus in 2018. That's my story.
So I also admit that these 3 people, They are really extraordinary people, and our homage to all of them, because they produce not only you but also many more like you, uh, and who are now torch bearers. So, and also pathfinders in the field of environment, climate change, sustainable development. So,
Well, if I might just add briefly, I think what you're saying though really goes to a very important point, which is even with these very complicated and you know, the IPCC report involves thousands of people in writing and commenting and etc. Today, there always are a number of heroes and sometimes, frankly, villains.
yeah.
And I think you and I, in the course of our careers, have been privileged to know and be influenced by some of these heroes, people like Professor Rowland, Gus Speth. But it really, one of the things that it says, Jim Hansen, Michael Mann, Christiana Figueres, one of the things that it says to me is, no matter how big and complicated a problem is, individuals make a difference.
Yeah.
And sometimes for better and sometimes for worse, right? I mean, unfortunately, there are, you know, have been a number of people who you and I know as well, who have been obstructionists, who have stood in the way of reaching agreements. And unfortunately, some of the problems we're having now is because those people have made a negative
difference. Say like Maurice Strong made a lot of difference. Say even Angela Merkel, lot of difference.
Mustafa
even
Klaus
Stoffer, he in 1991-92 he was the lead negotiator of Europe, EU. We negotiated with him. Then he became the he was the environment minister of Germany. And then he was also UNEP executive secretary. And many people, even Dan. Dan was a great negotiator. In climate arena, he has a lot of contribution. Say Ambassador Raul Estrada of Argentina. A figure in climate negotiation. So these people made a lot of difference in negotiation, even in say climate science arena, in environmental field, globally speaking, very few people who matter.
Right.
And still they matter.
Yes. Yes.
So I think even say Sir Nicholas sister. Right. Even today, he is trying to hammer on that climate finance is of monumental importance if we want to strike a deal in Glasgow at COP26. We need to ramp up climate finance, technology, capacity building to have net zero within our reach. Even say advance on climate adaptation front, we need climate finance, climate technology, and capacity building. Without those means of implementation, we can't hammer on net zero, neither adaptation. So that will unlock. So these people really matters.
Absolutely.
So, So you are coming back again after Alaska visit, and hopefully you will join us. What is your last day before going to Alaska?
I'm leaving in 1 week, a week from today.
So hopefully it will unearth some new information, unfold some new conclaves of, say, science, climate science,
I
environmental science.
I would be happy also to suggest, as I'm thinking about it, Kwamrol, I think Gus Beth would be another excellent person for you to reach out to.
Yeah.
And I think another subject about which I am much less expert, but which I think is really of current increasing importance, is the question of public versus private finance.
Yeah.
And I'm bringing that up because I've
but he is not going to be provoked these days.
Let me just suggest that you don't give up.
Yeah, no, so I have a great tenacity of playing long days.
Been reading the statements of the Indian Environment Minister.
Yeah.
And he is becoming, as you may know, extremely aggressive in making the point that at the next COP, he expects many developing countries will be insisting that there needs to be much more grant money. There must to be much more public money, and that the emphasis on mobilizing private funds is not responsive enough to the needs of India and other developing nations. And I think this is a very challenging issue at a time of COVID, at a time of enormous debt having been incurred. In the United States, we're now seeing a second year of record debt in the neighborhood of $3 trillion. It's now projected. So I think the likelihood, frankly, that much greater amounts of public finance will be coming, of donor finance, of grant funds, will be coming in the very short term, is going to be very, very difficult. I'm really worried about that. And I'm not against it. It's not from a personal point of view. But
I get your point. I got it. Yeah. Because you see, we will also discuss in our next episode climate finance in a big one, and try to have some climate finance wizards, like Sir Nicholas Stern and couple of others. Even I would love to have done, because he has also, and also Jonathan. Jonathan is a good guy, long-standing friend of mine, who can talk for hours, for days.
Jonathan is back in the government, so he may be much more. You know, Dan Reefsnyder is. I agree with you. Would be an excellent resource. He's a professor now at the University of Virginia, and has a lot to say. And he is not in the government, so he is completely free to say what he thinks.
But he is so shy to come. I try to provoke him, but he is not going to be provoked these days.
Let me just suggest that you don't give up.
Yeah, no, so I have a great tenacity of playing long days, long years. That's how I have been survived in UN negotiation for more than 43, 44 years.
I think another mutual friend of ours who I think has been on your program is Bonnetzella Biagini.
Yeah.
And I think Bonnie has a lot to say on adaptation.
Yeah. Bonnie is a great guy. She has joined us a couple of times. I think 4 or 5 times. And even today she was supposed, but she had gone with her grandchildren.
Well, this is
so. Thank you very, very much.
This is a great pleasure, Kwamrol, and I hope I've had some things that you will be interesting for your listeners.
Okay, and hope to see you again with some new information, new thought, new vision, because we know there are very few people who have vision, who can see 50 years down the lane, 100 years down the lane, and also can look back 50 years, 100 years, 200 years. So we want these wise men and women should guide us. We want to listen to them, and that's why Climate Channel is challenging those few people who are our last resort. Thank you very much. It was a great pleasure to have you and to talk to you in this 29th episode of Climate Action Pathways of Climate Channel. Thank you very much, Alan.
You're very welcome, Kwamrol, and best wishes to you too.
Thank you.
Is one of the most magnificent and elusive animals in the Amazon rainforest. But every day, jaguars and species around the world